Thank you, Steve. Good evening to you. May I begin with a prayer? Thou art above us, O God. Thou art within. Thou art in all things, yet contained by no thing. Teach us to seek Thee in all that has life, that we may see Thee as the light of life. Teach us to search for Thee in our own depths, that we may find Thee in every living soul. Amen. May I say how good it is to be here among you. Thank you for the welcome. One of the most cherished images in the Celtic tradition, from which I draw so heavily in my own life and in my teachings, one of the most cherished images is the image or the memory of John the Beloved leaning against Jesus at the Last Supper. It was said of him in the Celtic world that he had therefore heard the heartbeat of God. And he became a symbol of the practice of listening deep within ourselves, listening deep within one another, listening within the body of the earth for the beat of the sacred presence. Do we know that we are bearers of this unspeakably beautiful presence? And do we know that we can honor that presence in one another and in everything that has being? And do we know that it is that combination, growing in awareness that we are bearers of sacred presence, and a faithful commitment to honor that presence in one another, even in those whom we seem so different from, even in those who so threaten us. And looking for that presence deep within the body of the earth, within every creature, within every life form. Do we know that this combination holds the key to transformation? And I believe that that is essentially why we gather for days like this. Because deep within us is the holy desire to be part of healing, to be part of transformation, to be part of deep change within our own lives and families, within our communities, within our nations, and as a world community. So I invite us into this deep listening posture. I invite us these 2 days together to listen deep within, allowing ourselves to hear perhaps what we've never heard before or what we have forgotten. And at the same time, I invite us to listen way beyond the boundaries of where we have been taught to look for or to listen for the sacred. And I believe that these two ways of listening way beyond ourselves and listening deep within, that these two ways of listening are essentially one. That is, the deeper we move in the mystery of our being, the closer I believe we come to the heart of one another and to the heart of everything that has being. For all things have come forth from the heart of the one. Julian of Norwich, in the 14th century, said most simply, but most radically, she said, we are not just made by God, we are made of God. We are not simply fashioned from afar by a distant creator, but rather we come out of the very womb of God. which is why, of course, Julian so loves to refer to God as Mother as well as Father, because she sees us as coming out of the very essence of the One. Now, what does it mean to say that we are made of God? In part, it is to say that the wisdom of God is deep within us, deeper than the ignorance of what we have done. It is to say that the creativity of God, something of the essence of the creativity that is at the heart of the expanding universe, forever finding new form, new expression, new manifestation, something of the essence of that creativity is deep within us, deeper than any barrenness in our lives or relationships, deeper than any apparent dead ending or hopelessness in our nation or in our world. This capacity, pure gift of God, this capacity within us to give birth to what has never been before. But above all else, to say that we are made of God is to say, as Julian does, that deep within us are what she calls the love longings of God. The love longings, the yearnings for oneness, the holy desire for union. And that these love longings are deeper in us than any of the fears or hatreds that hold us in such fragmentation and tragedy of separation that we witness in our world and that we know in our own communities and nations. So part of what I'll be doing these 2 days is to ask, what would it look like if these true depths of our being are of Godness? What would it look like if these depths were to come forth again in radically new ways? Or to use one of Jesus' favorite mantras, what would it look like if the true depths of our being were to be born anew? This phrase is so central to the teachings of Jesus that we need to reclaim it, because it's been hijacked to give the impression that we need to become something other than ourselves. But let's be very clear, Jesus was a rabbi. So his starting point was not the Christian doctrine of original sin. This is a Christian problem, not a Jewish problem. Nor is it a Muslim problem. For Judaism and Islam begin with the celebration that what is deepest in us is of God, not that what is deepest in us is opposed to God. A couple of years ago in Richmond, Virginia, I was part of an interfaith dialogue. There was a rabbi, a Muslim imam, and I was there as the Christian teacher. And after some dialogue between the three of us, we opened the evening up for people to make comments or ask questions. And someone in the audience asked if we would speak about original sin. Undoubtedly a Christian. I sometimes refer to it as our obsessive-compulsive disorder. So this person asked if we would speak about original sin, and the rabbi was the first to respond, and he said, original sin. He said that to most Jews would mean that was a really original sin. That was a really creative sin. At that moment I thought, thank God for interfaith relationship. Here a rabbi had got a whole room full of about 250 Christians laughing about this absurd doctrine of original sin. I say absurd because one only has to hold a newborn child in one's arms to know the absurdity of this doctrine. I regard the 4 most sacred moments of my life as the births of my 4 children. I saw in their eyes the light from which all have come. I smelled in their skin the freshness of our beginnings. So, one of the things that we're being invited to do at this moment in time, I believe, is to learn how to laugh at the absurdity of one of the doctrines that has dominated the whole landscape of our theological inheritance. But if we don't laugh, we need to cry. Because this doctrine has done untold wrong in the lives of countless of our brothers and sisters, and I think probably within many of us here, in terms of how we view what is deepest in us, or how we look, or how we view what is deepest in another. So part of what we're going to be doing these 2 days together is to ask, what would it look like if the true depths of our being were to come forth again? And I'll be inviting us to reflect on that as individuals, but I will also be inviting us to reflect on that as a Christian household. What would it look like if the true depths of our soul were to come forth again, to enable us to be bearers of blessing in this world, to be part of the holy work of transformation and healing and reconnection? The rebirthing of God, Christianity's struggle for new beginning, my most recent writing, is really like a text for these days together. I was in Dublin around the time of the launch of the book, and there was a sister, a religious sister, who was present for the talk, and she turned out she had been a midwife for most of her vocation. And she was fascinated by all the birthing images in the theme of the book. And at the end she said, now the God of so much of our religious inheritance, she said, the God of so much of our tradition is really a pretty small God. You know, we've got God well domesticated to look after our nation, to look after the human species, to look after our religion. So she said, we have received in our tradition quite a small God. And she said the God that is trying to be born, the sacredness that's trying to come forth in a new way, she said, is a cosmic God, way beyond the boundaries that we have tried to place on sacredness. So she said, the God that's trying to be born is quite a cosmic God. She said, so we're in for quite a stretching. When she said that, I said to her, now, sister, why could I not have had this conversation with you before writing the epilogue to the book? And, I mean, she really got it. We're in for a stretching. And I was so excited by the sister's word that I phoned my wife back in Edinburgh that night to share with Ali this midwife sense of we are in for a big stretching. And this released in Ali a realization that had come to her halfway through the labor of the birth of our first child. And that was, she realized halfway through the labor, there's no going back. And this also is true. There's no going back. We may pretend that we can go back to that small God. We may pretend that we can go back to that smallness of the sense of sacredness. We may pretend that we can go back to a small sense of nationhood in which we just look after ourselves and ignore the well-being of other nations. That pretense that we could go back just to looking after the human species and ignore Earth's other species. Or that narrowness of thinking that we can go back to just living with the wisdom of our religious inheritance and ignore the holy wisdom of other traditions. But there is no real going back. That's an escape from this moment in time. And of course, we're seeing a lot of fear at this moment in time and trying to go back to a romantic or golden age that pretends that just our nation can be strong, rather than knowing that the way forward, the awareness that is breaking in through every major discipline of thought and spiritual tradition, is one of interbeing. It's one of interrelatedness. And we will be well, we will be strong, we will be safe, to the extent that we are in relationship with one another across the boundaries that have divided us. John, this one who is celebrated in the Celtic world as having leaned against Jesus at the Last Supper, this one who symbolizes a listening deep within ourselves and within one another and within the body of the earth for the sacred. The opening words of John's prologue, or the prologue to John's Gospel, are, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And then he goes on to say, "And everything has come into being through the Word," which is to say that everything essentially is an expression of God. Everything essentially is an utterance of the One. Do you know that that's what you are? That that is the essence of your being? That you have been born into this world because the world needs that unique and unrepeatable expression of God that is the heart of your being. So much does the Celtic tradition love these opening words to the prologue of John, that very early on we find paraphrases of the opening words. And one of the paraphrases that I love that comes very early on is, "In the beginning was the sound. And the sound was with God, and the sound was God, and everything has been sounded into being." Everything essentially is a sound or is a vibration of the One. And if somehow that sound or expression or vibration of the One were to be withdrawn from the universe, then everything would cease to exist. For it is not simply a dimension of the universe. It is the very essence of everything that has being. New science now speaks of the sound of the beginning as something that can be detected throughout the entire universe. It is everywhere. And that sound continues. And new science has identified that sound as a B flat, way down. Now, not to be too boastful about these matters, but the Scottish bagpipes are tuned to the B flat. It's a wonderful time in which we're living, isn't it? The convergence that is happening between new science and ancient wisdom. Given the significance of John in the Celtic world, this love of John. This has led me over the last 10, 15 years to delve more and more deeply into John writings, into John legends, into writings attributed to John. And it may be that none of these writings come literally from his hand. It may be that they come from the community of John, and in that sense they carry some of the authority of John without him actually being the author. But many of the writings attributed to John did not make it into the canon of Scripture, as defined by the 4th century imperial council of the Church. Christianity, of course, by that stage had got into bed with empire. And there was pressure from empire to have convenient truth, not inconvenient truth. So we need to ask some questions about what was happening in the 4th century, when creeds were defined that have dominated the Christian household ever since, or when boundaries were placed around sacred readings. I often wonder, in what other area of life would we tolerate being told what to read by a 4th century council of men who had been appointed by empire? And yet we've pretty passively simply read what they told us to read. So we need to ask some questions, and it is for every generation in our Christian household to make some decisions about what we should be reading and what we should be encouraging our children and one another to read. And I believe we should be guided above all else by whether these readings are feeding that holy desire that is of God within us to move back into relationship with all things. These love longings that Julian speaks of. One of the writings attributed to the community of John and John that didn't make it into the canon was a piece of writing called the Acts of John. The Acts of John has a very beautiful description of the Last Supper, in which Jesus invites the disciples to form a circle so that they can do a Hebrew circle dance together. What a relief it is that they formed a circle, and not the straight lines of empire, in which truth will be dispensed from above. Because it's in the circle of relationship the new truths are forever trying to well up. It's in our circle of relationship as nations, in the circle of our relationship as religious traditions, in the circle of our relationship as species, that we are being invited to access this living well of truth. We've so often been given the impression in our Western Christian inheritance that everything of ultimate value has already been stated. And what we need to do is either sign up or get out. Instead of seeing that there are truths that we've known nothing of yet, that are welling up within the human consciousness, that we're being invited to access a living well of truth. But Jesus invites the disciples in the Acts of John account to form a circle, and they begin a simple Hebrew circle dance. And at one point in the story, Jesus stands in the middle of the circle and says, the whole universe takes part in the dance. Beautiful words. The whole universe takes part in the dance. This story is presenting Jesus as having come to lead us back into relationship with all things, to serve this dance of the universe, to be part of it, to help lead it. This is an image of what can be called the holiness of wholeness. No longer the holiness of separateness. This lie that has dominated so much of our culture and so much of our religious inheritance, in which we've been encouraged to pretend that we could be well primarily through paths of separateness, pretending that our nation could be well just by looking after the well-being of our nation and exploiting and wronging or ignoring the well-being of other nations. This notion of separateness that has so often dominated our communities and even what it means to be a family. This notion that many of us know as fathers and mothers, in which our culture and our religion at times has said, oh yes, he's a good father because he's looking after his family. It is a new fatherhood, and it is an ancient fatherhood that we are being invited to claim. And I believe I'm a good father only to the extent that I am also looking after the health and the education of the family down the road. And my family will be truly well to the extent that our families are well. When Steve was introducing me, he asked how many had been to Iona, and I was facing Steve, so I didn't get to see your hands. How many of you have been to the island of Iona? The rest of you need to come. Not all at once. It's a small island. Whenever I return to the island of Iona, as I do for our 3 one-week pilgrimage events, and then usually also for family holiday time back on the island, the first place I long to pray in, and the first place I go to pray in, is not the rebuilt Benedictine Abbey that has received so much of the historical focus on Iona. The place that I go to pray in are the ruins of the nunnery of Iona. And I find I'm not alone in that desire. Often I find other individuals there. Sometimes I find small groups doing impromptu ritual, sometimes doing simple circle dances like the one I've just described. What's drawing us to the nunnery to pray? And I believe it is the desire to pray in the unenclosed space, to pray in relation to what the Celts called the great cathedral of earth, sea, and sky. That is a holy yearning that is deep within us. The yearning to bring our spirituality back into intimacy with nature, rather than in alienation from it. But it's not just the desire to pray in relation to earth, sea, and sky that is leading us to a place like the nunnery, is it? The nunnery, because we can do that sort of prayer up on the hill on Iona or down at the beach, and I love to pray there as well. But what is it that takes us to the nunnery? It's because the nunnery, I believe, it's because the nunnery was a place where women lived and worshipped and wept and laughed and prayed and lived faithfully together for centuries. And one of the great yearnings that is stirring in the human soul at this moment in time is the yearning to come back into relationship with the sacredness of the feminine. And we may see denials of that sacred desire to honor the feminine. We may see enormous and tragic exceptions to that desire now dominating our own countries. But that abusing of the feminine is the death throes of a bankrupt way of seeing and living. And something much deeper than that is trying to be born at this moment in time. And the reality is that the desire to pray in relationship with the sacredness of the feminine and the desire to pray and to live in relationship to the sacredness of the earth, that these two are interwoven. Because often a subordination of the feminine has gone hand in hand with the subordination of the earth. These two belong inseparably together, and they belong as common features or interwoven features in the rebirthing of the sacred at this moment in time that we are being invited to be part of. There's another place I love to pray, and it's on this side of the Atlantic, and it's a place called New Harmony, Indiana. How many of you have been to the roofless church of New Harmony, Indiana? It's a hidden away treasure in this land. Over 50 years ago, long in advance of the earth awareness that we are now in the midst of, one of the most beautiful women that I ever came to know was Jane Owen of New Harmony, Indiana. She died 5 years ago at the age of 96. But over 50 years ago, she saw, in very close collaboration with the American-German theologian Paul Tillich, who already at that stage was speaking of God as ground of being. But Jane also in very close relationship with George MacLeod, the founder of the modern-day Iona community. Jane was seeing that our sacred sites must not primarily be represented by enclosed separation from the earth. So she oversaw the construction of the roofless church of New Harmony, Indiana. And it truly doesn't have a roof. It has 4 defining walls. And the structure speaks of the importance of our sacred sites not being viewed as cut off or separate from the sacredness of earth, sea, and sky. Right at the heart of the roofless church of New Harmony, there's a sculpture by the Jewish artist Jacques Lipschitz. It is a representation of the Spirit descending in the form of a dove onto an abstract divine feminine form, which is opening to give birth. So Lipschitz at one level is pointing to the Jesus story conceived by the Spirit in the womb of Mary. But he's also pointing to the universe story, that everything is conceived by the Spirit in the womb of the cosmos. Everything is born of the sacred. Now, isn't it interesting that it took a Jewish artist to see that the Jesus story is the universe story, rather than seeing the Jesus story as an exception to the universe, seeing the Jesus story as the Celtic tradition also celebrates the Jesus story as disclosure of what is deepest in all things. Or the word that is used sometimes is to see Jesus as the revelation of the universe. This word that comes from the Latin root revelare, which just means to lift the veil. Jesus is seen as lifting the veil to show us that all life is essentially sacred or coming from the sacredness of the womb of the One. There's a phrase that we use in the Christian household every week. Perhaps it's used every day in different parts of the world. But the phrase is referring to Jesus as the only begotten Son of God. And so often that phrase is used to give the impression that Jesus is of God in a way that is entirely different to how we and all things are of God. It was Meister Eckhart, the 14th century mystic, who throws light on this phrase when he says, only begotten means begotten of the only one. Jesus showing us that we are only begotten. We and all things are begotten of the only one. Now, we can't all worship in the nunnery of Iona Abbey, of Iona Nunnery, nor can we all worship on a regular basis in the roofless church of New Harmony. I believe, however, that we are being called in the language we use within our sacred sites, in the rituals we use, in the symbolism that we employ, in the teachings that we offer, to keep pointing back out to the sacredness of the earth as the real context of sacredness. And that at best our sacred sites are to be like side chapels onto the great cathedral of the universe, pointing back repeatedly, rather than seeing sacredness as something that we find in isolation or separation. After my time at Iona Abbey in leadership of the Abbey community, I went to be part of the team at St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, which is our little national cathedral. Early in my time there, I had a dream in which I was standing in the pulpit about to deliver a sermon. And in the dream, there was no roof to the cathedral. It was like the roofless church of New Harmony, but I hadn't yet experienced that place. But below me in the dream, below the pulpit, there was an artificial ceiling under which the people sat. And in the dream I had to make a decision. Should I speak from the pulpit or should I descend under the artificial ceiling? In the dream I realized I must remain in the open place. I must speak from the openness, from the interrelatedness of all things, the sacredness of all things. Now, this was a particular dream that came at a particular moment in my particular journey, but it is a dream, I believe, that belongs to us. It belongs deeply to this moment in time. For part of what we are being asked to decide is, where will we speak from? Will we continue to speak from these places of separatenesses? Will we continue to speak from a sense of separateness of our nation over against other nations? Will we continue to speak from within the Christian household as if it is essentially separate from the other great households of faith? Will we continue to speak from a place of separateness as a human species instead of in deep relationship with all of Earth's community? The 6th century Irish saint Columbanus said, he said, if you wish to know the Creator, come to know the creatures. If you wish to know the Creator, come to know the creatures. Now, is that not a pretty obvious statement? But it's one of those obvious truths that we've missed for most of our Western Christian inheritance, to the extent that we have looked to the transcendent in very limited terms and ignored the deep immanence of the sacred at the heart of everything that has being. In the Celtic tradition, everything is seen essentially as theophany, that is, as a revealing of the divine. Many years ago on Iona, during one of our pilgrimages, I shared an evening meal with a woman from Florida. She was in her mid-70s. And over the evening meal, she wanted to share with me what her spiritual journey had been. And she particularly wanted to speak about something that had happened 55 plus years earlier, when she was an adolescent in church one Sunday. Halfway through the service, a dog wandered into the church, sauntered up the central aisle, got up to the altar, began to sniff around the altar. And it did not do what you think I'm going to say. Instead, it left. And what that woman said to me was, it didn't like what it smelled. It didn't smell right. It didn't smell natural. And that woman, who was then an adolescent girl, got up and followed the dog out of the church, and she had never been back. Now, this woman's story is, of course, eccentric in some of its details, but at another level, this woman's story is the story of hundreds of thousands, and I would say millions, of our brothers and sisters who began life in the Christian household, and they don't come back to the family table to be fed anymore because something doesn't smell right. It doesn't smell natural. This woman told her story without apology. She didn't apologize for her instinct for the sacredness of the natural. But she didn't tell her story with pride either. In fact, she told her story with quite a bit of sadness. And why did she come to Iona? I believe she sensed that the Celtic tradition would honor her story, would understand it and reverence it. But she told her story with sadness because for over half a century, this woman had lived without community with whom to pray and weep and mourn and celebrate at great transition times, without community with whom to work in this holy work of transformation. And in this also, I believe, she is not alone. Because the millions of our brothers and sisters who are living in exile, and many of us in this room are part of that exile, many of them are lonely too. And many of them are yearning for new language, new ritual, new teachings that will keep making the connection between our gathering places, our sacred places, and the great cathedral of earth, sea, and sky. longing to find ways to honor, to articulate, to celebrate, to access the sacredness of nature. Tonight I'd like to point to two of the great teachers in the stream of spirituality that we now refer to as Celtic spirituality. This is a modern term, of course, but we use it to refer to the distinctive characteristics that emerged in the earliest Christian centuries in Celtic territory and has continued over the centuries, although often has been pushed underground or declared as heretical or accused as pantheistic. One of the first teachers to emerge in the Celtic world, in the Celtic Christian world, was Irenaeus of Lyon, I-R-E-N-A-E-U-S, Irenaeus or Irenaeus of Lyon. He emerges in 2nd century Gaul, Celtic territory. Irenaeus' teacher was Polycarp, and Polycarp's teacher was John the Beloved. So just one teacher separates these two, Irenaeus from John, and in Irenaeus we hear all of the favorite themes of John, especially from the prologue of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and everything has come into being through the Word. Everything is essentially expression or utterance of the One. Irenaeus is concerned about something that is already beginning to express itself in Mediterranean Christianity in the 2nd century. And this teaching comes to the fore, especially in the 4th century, when Christianity becomes imperial religion. And it expresses itself at that stage formally as the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, in which it was taught that a distant creator had fashioned the universe out of nothing. Irenaeus says, like all of the great Celtic teachers after him, creation doesn't come out of nothing. It was not fashioned out of nothing. Creation, the cosmos, comes out of the very, and the word he uses is shocking to our Western ears. He says it's come out of the substance of God. In other words, this stuff is sacred. And how we handle one another physically in relationship is a sacred matter. And how we handle or care for the bodies of the suffering, of the hungry, of the homeless, of the refugees of our world. This is a sacred matter. How we handle the matter of the earth, how we handle the earth's resources with reverence and with justice is a holy matter. Imperial religion, of course, was doing what was convenient to the state. And that's what imperial religion has always done. Whether it's with the Roman Empire, or the British Empire, or the American Empire. Because what empires want to do is to neutralize matter. And that's what the doctrine of creation ex nihilo did. Matter isn't sacred in and by itself. It's neutral. It was created out of nothing. And once we neutralize matter, then we think we can do whatever we wish to it. If everything is essentially sacred in its essence, if everything has come out of the womb of the One, or as Irenaeus says, out of the very substance of God, if everything is essentially sacred, then what is the role of Christ? Because in so much of our Western Christian inheritance, we have been given the impression that Christ comes to save us from our nature. In so much of our inherited Christology, Christ comes almost to airlift us into well-being, which is essentially a desertion of the universe and of the earth. Irenaeus says, Christ is the recapitulation of the word that is at the heart of all things. The word through which everything has been expressed into being. What is it we do when we recapitulate something? We say it again. We utter afresh what we have forgotten, or what needs to be brought back up into greater consciousness and awareness. So he sees Christ not as a new word, but as a re-uttering of the word that is at the heart of all things. And Irenaeus sees our Christhood, that is, growing into the maturity of Christ, as a resounding of the sound that is at the heart of all things, or a resounding with the vibration of the sacred that is deep within the matter of the universe and at the very heart of all being. The second teacher that I invite us to listen to briefly tonight is from the 20th century, and he can be seen as a 20th century resurrection of this early 2nd century Gallic wisdom from ancient Gaul. The teacher I speak of is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, French mystic, scientist, Jesuit priest. Teilhard says, at the heart of matter is the heart of God. The deeper we move in anything that has being, the closer we come to the sound, to the word, to the sacred presence from which everything has come into being. He says what the incarnation teaches us to see is that we can be saved only by becoming one with the earth. That's the whole movement of the incarnation. It's the oneness of heaven and earth, the oneness of the divine and the human, the oneness of spirit and matter. And yet what have we done with this most radical doctrine at the heart of our Christian household? We've said it applies to one. And that one is an exception to the universe, rather than revelation of the universe. In 1926, Teilhard, as a young Jesuit, becomes an inconvenience to power. Think of the implications of his teaching. At the heart of matter is the heart of God. This teaching that was radically inconvenient to status quo and power. The Vatican forbids him to teach and to write. And they decide that the way to deal with Teilhard is to send him to China. So he is sent to China to be part of a paleontological dig. Little did the Vatican realize what the East would do to Teilhard, because it's in the East that Teilhard now begins to speak about the sacredness of the feminine and what he calls the fragrance of the feminine that is deep within everything that has being. He's not just speaking about females. He's speaking about the fragrance of the feminine that is deep within all. And by that he is referring to that dimension within us and within all things that attracts oneness, that invites union, something of which we see in the universal law of gravitation. At some level, every atom in the universe longs to remain in relationship with every other atom, otherwise the whole thing would spin off into unrelatedness. Science doesn't claim to understand that attraction, it describes it. Brian Swim, the new cosmologist, calls it the urge to merge. The Earth has been revolving around the Sun for 4.5 billion years. This could be described as a long-term stable relationship. It's a love affair. And we are born of this love affair. And we are born for love. We are born to serve this moving of everything in relationship. For all has come forth from the womb or the substance of God to move in interrelationship, the holiness of wholeness. When Teilhard was being disciplined by his own religious tradition, he wrote, "The more I give myself to the earth, the more I give myself to God." He returned to Europe after the Second World War and very quickly became an inconvenience again in Europe. The Vatican decided he must be sent into a second exile. So this time they sent him to that other remote outpost of humanity, the United States of America. He was sent to New York City, where he was part of the Jesuit community, although in fact often he was away on paleontological digs in Africa and elsewhere. One of the beautiful things about Teilhard, to me and to many of us, is that he was a grateful son of our Christian household, and he tried to live in faithful commitment to that inheritance. He was a teacher, he was a writer, but he had been forbidden to do either. In 1951, he agreed to his first act of disobedience. And I believe he did this out of love. He signed over all of his writings in 1951 to his personal assistant in Paris, Mademoiselle Mortier, which meant that when he died, his writings would be hers and would not belong to the Jesuit order or the church. Teilhard died on Easter Day, 1955, in New York City, relatively alone and relatively unknown. There were 10 people at his funeral, and one person accompanied his body to burial up the Hudson River. But Mademoiselle Mortier began to release his writings one at a time in the late 1950s. I still meet Roman Catholic priests and sisters who were training in the late 50s, and they have memories of reading Teilhard under cover with their flashlight at night, strapping his books under their mattress during the day. This is exactly what theology needs to be. It needs to be so exciting and so related to the unfolding journey of the world that we will read it no matter who tells us not to, because in reading it we will know that our holy desire for oneness is being addressed and fed. During one of my last visits to New York City, I was teaching at Iona College just outside New York City in New Rochelle. And Sister Kathleen Degnan, a sister of Notre Dame, who teaches at the college, invited me to go on a pilgrimage to Teilhard's grave. So she took me to the grave. It was a rainy April day, unaccustomed as I am to rain. And there we were. In order to access the grave, we had to ask for a key, because what had been the Jesuit grounds has been sold off to the Culinary Institute of America, which surrounds the old graveyard. So we had to get a key to enter. And we were kneeling at the grave and offering prayer of thanks. But Sister Kathleen moved very beautifully from prayer into direct address. And she was speaking to Teilhard, thanking him for his faithfulness, for speaking to him as teacher, prophet. It's a very beautiful moment. And at the end of our prayers, we were still kneeling, and Sister Kathleen, looking down at the grave, said to me, "I just love him. I would like to get down into that box and give him a hug." I love Teilhard as well, but that was not my inclination. We decided that in honor of Teilhard, we should go into the Culinary Institute and have a French meal and some red wine. But we had to hand the key back in. And as we did so, I asked the gatekeeper, I said, "Do many people come to visit Teilhard's grave?" And she said, "Oh yes, every day, dozens." This prophet, who is speaking into the heart of this moment in time. In one of his last writings in New York City, he had written, "Christianity is at the end of one of its natural cycles of existence." Christianity is at the end of one of its natural cycles of existence. It needs, he said, to be born again. And in that born-again Christianity, he said, Christ will no longer be seen as a deserter of the earth. He will be seen as lover of the earth, as one with the earth. Before we do some hearing from one another, I invite us into a simple chant. This is from a recording of chants that I've put together with some Scottish musician friends. And the chant that we'll be using now is based on words from the book of Psalms. The words are, let me hear what you will speak when I turn to you in my heart. Let me hear what you will speak when I turn to you in my heart. I invite you to join the chant as soon as you become familiar with it in this recorded version. There are a couple of instrumental interludes during which we can just allow the words to silently resonate within us. And then when the lyrics come back in, we can join it again. And then at the end of the chant, it's about a 5-minute chant, just a moment or two of stillness. And during the chant and at the end of the chant, I invite us not so much to think about the themes of this evening, so much as just to pay attention. What is calling our attention from deep within? So it's a way of moving from the head to that equipoise, that place between the head and the heart, which I think is one of the most creative places to be. So I invite us just to pay attention. What's been shining for us tonight? What's been beckoning our attention? and to use the chant as an attentive time. And then after we've done some inner attentiveness, then there'll be some opportunity to hear from one another. I'm going to suggest that after the chant we turn to a person or two next to us, one or two other people, and to share what's been calling our attention. But I'll say more about that, and then there'll be time to make comments and ask questions from within the full group. So is that clear enough? Lots of instructions there. We're going to have a chant. Please join the chant as you become familiar with it. And then just a little bit of silence afterwards, before we share. The words are, let me hear what you will speak when I turn to you in my heart. An opportunity now to do some hearing from one another. So for a few minutes now, I invite us to, in groups of one or two, of two or three, but preferably not less than two, to do some hearing from one another. So anything at all that's been stirring for you tonight, an opportunity just to say that to the person or to two people beside you. And if you could keep half an eye up here when you're sharing, and when you see me raise my hand, if you could raise your hand and bring to a close what you're sharing, then we can move back into the full group, and there'll be some opportunity for you to make any comment you wish or a question if you want, to bring that into the entire group. Okay? So just a few minutes in groups of two or three. Thank you. We have a couple of microphones at the front here, and if there's something that you would like to offer to the entire group by way of observation or sharing or comment, or if there's a question you'd like to put, it doesn't need to be a question though. If there's anything you'd like to bring to the whole group, if you could raise your hand, and we'll make sure that the microphone reaches you.
I've been following the thing with the North Dakota pipeline, and as you were talking, I couldn't help but think of all the way the Native American beliefs have just sort of gone along. It's everything that you have said. I think they have so much to teach us.
Yes.
And yet so much that has been done to them has been done by the church in the name of religion. And sadly, as a Presbyterian minister, that frightens me and makes me angry.
Yes. Thank you. There's a great resonance between the native traditions of the world, and I think many aspects of the Celtic tradition can be described as a native spirituality. And I think one of the reasons why there's such a resurgence of interest in and a desire to engage with and to receive from the treasure of Celtic spirituality, I think one of the reasons why there's so much interest on this side of the Atlantic, I think it relates to the wisdom that we have sensed in the Native American spiritual tradition here. I think that has encouraged many within our Christian household to say, is there a parallel stream? Is there something within our own inheritance that we can similarly access around a deep knowing of the sacredness of the earth? And I think that we have much to be thankful for in that to the extent that the Native American tradition has been heard. And I think it holds a wisdom that carries great blessing for those of us in different traditions and for us as a world today in our relationship with the earth. Yeah, thank you.
I think that so many of us, and I'll include myself in this, spend so much of our time locked and locked up and locked on to life, that what you are speaking of is really calling us to open and to resonate more deeply with things being with God and of God, and everything is of God. And given the world we are living in today, it seems to me that that is extraordinarily important for us all to listen. And I really appreciate the way you articulated that, because it really brought it home for me.
Thank you. One of the great teachers in the Celtic tradition from which I draw so heavily is the 9th century Irish teacher. His name is John Scotus Erugina, a bit of a mouthful, difficult name to get a hold of, but so much easier when you translate it, because it just means John the Irishman from Ireland. And Erugina loves to play with words, and one of the words he plays with is the Greek for God, theos. And he says it's derived from the verb theo, which means to flow, because God is the one who flows through all things, like this subterranean stream that's flowing through all things. And if somehow that stream, that flow, were to be dammed up, then everything would cease to exist. And there's a modern day Scottish poet called Kenneth White who builds more playfully on Erugina's playfulness and says God is not only the flow, God is the glow flow that is deep within all things. And I love to play even further on the playfulness and say that what we're being called to do is to let go to the glow flow. And your words of letting go instead of sort of somehow locking on, I think are so important for us to be applying, and for us to be finding ways in which to live into that deep faithfulness. We don't need to place anything in another or anything in within ourselves. What we need to do is to find these ways of letting go to what is most deeply there. And part of that is the costliness of dissolving the way in which the ego is forever wanting to lock on and control, or is forever wanting to say that it is the center. This is not to put down the ego, but the ego is given to this great faculty of consciousness and willpower that we have been given. It's given to serve the center, not to be the center. And Jesus' teaching, one of the other great mantras of Jesus' teaching is that we need to die in order to live. We need to let go of the way in which the ego desperately tries to hold on and control. And we're needing to let go to that deeper flow, and to be attentive to how we can liberate that flow at the heart of others. Thank you. We have time for one more comment or question, and then I'm not going to disappear. There can be some further chatting in the lounge.
You mentioned getting a feel for the creator by looking at the creatures. And I watched a series on the BBC by David Attenborough, and I was really struck by the beauty and the spectacular creativity there, but also a sense of kind of the brutality and the ruthlessness of nature as well. And how do you reconcile that kind of sense of heartlessness that you see in nature with what you just describe as kind of the unity with God and creation, etc.
Mm. Thank you. Well, I think one of the things I would want to say that is that the madness of destructiveness that we see at the human scale is of a different order entirely from any destructive energy that we find in the natural world. That we have taken the shadow side to levels that the natural world knows nothing of. So I think one of the ways in which the Celtic tradition tries to pay deep attention to the sacredness within the natural is to celebrate the wildness of God. And that's part of what we see in the natural world. There's been a tendency often to try to domesticate the sacred in our religion, and end up, of course, domesticating it for our purposes. So let's find ways of really honoring the wildness of the sacred in nature, the wildness of nature, and also to recognize that wildness is deep within us, and that part of the way of really honoring the sacred in one another is to never think that we can somehow tame, or that the right thing is somehow to bring into domestication that wild, unbounded, unbridled energy of the holy. I think often the sort of nature red in tooth and claw argument has been used, in the wake of evolutionary thought, the survival of the fittest. But I think most scientists now would not regard Darwin's emphasis on survival of the fittest so much as pointing to this deep interrelatedness within all things, and the extent to which what we see in nature and in the unfolding of the universe is this interdependence and interrelatedness of all things. And one of the things, going back to the native tradition, that I think we have so much to learn from is their irreverent approach to how we take life, or how we access any form of life for our service. So, before cutting a tree down, in fact, honoring the life within the tree, and stepping into a type of expression of gratitude and thanks for the sacrifice of the tree's life for our well-being. And if we were to approach any interrelationship that we have with the earth or with the creatures in terms of that reverence, then I think we would find ourselves sort of radically challenged as to how we're living, how we're consuming, how we're accessing the natural for our well-being. Thank you. There'll be more opportunity tomorrow for comment and engagement, and also there'll be some opportunity for informal conversation in the lounge. May I offer a closing prayer? This is from Sounds of the Eternal, prayer for Friday evening. Bless us this night, O God, and those whom we know and love. Bless us this night, O God, and those with whom we are not at peace. Bless us this night, O God, and every human family. Bless us with deep sleep. Bless us with dreams that will heal our soul. Bless us with the night's silent messages of eternity, that we may be set free by love. Bless us in the night, O God, that we may be set free to love. Amen.